We're going to begin. Okay. Obviously, this is a very difficult time for everyone with the devastating news. It's so difficult to process. Um, there are no magical spiritual solutions, for these, kinds of horrific and unfathomable situations. But what we do know is that the Torah itself addresses all contingencies, and the Torah in Sefer Bamidbar discusses what happens to or how one should respond in the time of a war, and other crises as well. I just wanted to say something before we actually begin the limud. But pasuk in Baloscha says, "V'chisavo milchama ba'artzachem."
Sure.
The war breaks out, or when a war comes to you in your nation, alatzara tzorereschem b'harayosem b'chatzotzros, that you should literally, call out, cry out, b'chatzotzros, chatzotzros, trumpets. Niskartim lefnei Hashem Elokechem, and you will be remembered, or there'll be your worthy deeds will be remembered by the Ribono Shel Olam v'noshatem mi'ovechem, and you'll be saved, from your enemies. So the Sifrei, the Medrash Halacha says that this pasuk is not only doesn't refer only to war, it refers also to other calamities, even though war is what's emphasized. And it doesn't refer only to a defensive war that takes place on your own territory. It refers to any war that you engage in. But the fact is that the pshat, the simple reading of the psukim, speak about war, as the Netziv points out, and others. So even though it expands to other calamities, sadly, we just went through, a pandemic, and that was a very anxious time, and it left a lot of terrible, destruction and ruin in its wake. But it would seem that milchama, that a war is something different, and Rav Hirsch, expanding on what the Sifrei obviously picked up on, notes that typically when you speak about war, you speak about going out to war, being an aggressor. It's kiseitze lemilchama alayvecha. In most cases in Tanakh, war is spoken of in terms of yitzia, going to battle. And Rav Hirsch says whenever you find it happens a few places, not only here, but it's pretty rare. Kisavo'u milchama, when you talk about a war coming to you, he said that implies an additional element, number one, of urgency, because you're trying to defend your own territory, trying to stabilize your own region. You don't have the luxury, of what they call in Israel, back in the day, an oref, where you have the front, and then you have, everything else, which is mostly calm and safe. But more than that, he says when it's kisavo milchama, the implication is you didn't know that it was coming. It was unpredictable, a surprise, horrible surprise, and it was unprovoked. It's typically, there are tensions, between nations or peoples, and you have to make a decision, a strategic decision. Those are also very difficult, obviously. But when somebody sneak attacks you in your own territory, and then you find yourself at war, without the luxury of having a front, that is distanced from the populations, that's particularly devastating. And it's also interesting that the Torah then describing the enemy says al hatzar katzorereskem, the provocateur who provokes you, the double language. There's some discussion in the Mefarshim. You have the word tsar, like the Haman was a tsar oyev. Here you also have the word oyev, Shatem Oivechem. There's some discussion in the Malbim and the Netziv and others, about the differences between Tsar and Oyev. Some of them say it in opposite ways. It doesn't really matter so much because they're both here. But the bigger idea is sometimes you have right. We're going to talk about Soros in a minute in Yibum, in Yavama, and Yavamos, which we're going to start in just a couple of minutes. Sometimes you have rivals, and that can be still a very dangerous. Your rivals can go to war with you, but typically, there's a certain rationality in war. Uh, Even when it's evil, there's certain rationality. There are benefits to the to the guilty part or the evil party or the initiating party. Those benefits, may be morally problematic, but at the end of the day, you can understand and you can identify, with a rival. But when you have a tsar hatzorer, somebody who provokes for the sake of provoking, or an oyev, as the Malbim understands it, somebody who just is committed to evil or to barbarism, who doesn't have any lines whatsoever. So then the crisis is intensified manifold, and that I think is what this pasuk is describing. That when you find yourself in that situation, and sadly, I think that very much depicts what happened on Shmini Atzeres for us, or Simchas Torah and Eretz Yisrael on Shabbos. Eretz Yisrael, Klal Yisrael found itself in a kisavo milchama, a tzara tzarer, and an oyev situation. And the Torah says that what we should do is v'harei osem b'chatzotzros. We should call out, with chatzotzros, and that is the basis for v'nizkartem l'fnei Hashem Elokechem v'noishatem me'oivechem. So, what does that mean? So, just two perspectives very quickly. The Rambam in Hilchos Tainis, Perek Aleph, says that these words, v'harios and b'chatzotzros, refer to a separate mitzvah saseh, a separate positive commandment, that whenever we find ourselves in crises, and the Rambam says, doesn't matter whether it's a man-made crisis or a nature, generated crisis, but the first thing we should do is we should call out. We should blow shofar, chatzotzros, tefillah. But for the Rambam, the purpose of it is what he calls midarke hatshuva, meaning we should individually and we should collectively, try to introspect and see, whether or not our own behavior or the modification of our own behavior can't also be, a source of merit, going forward, for Klal Yisrael in its time of need. So according to the Rambam, this pasuk refers to self-improvement and self-examination, in a time of crisis. We just finished the period of tshuva, and the tshuva of the Yom Noraim is brought about by the calendar and by a celestial judgment. But any time of crisis, where we pray for the intervention, of the Ribbono Shel Olam, is a time in which we want to, put our best foot forward and be worthy of positive intervention. And in that respect, most of us are not on the front, and we're not, contributing in a direct manner, and we feel very useless, or, at least, frustrated by the inability, to contribute, in a more obvious and tangible and concrete way. And most of us don't have the ability to do that. Most people in Eretz Yisrael don't either, except for the soldiers and the generals. But the idea that, there is also, a spiritual side to, crisis, and to the request, throwing ourselves at the, at the mercy of the Ribbono Shel Olam, and that requires of us certain commitment and conduct is an important theme, and it's something all of us can look at. But there's a second theme as well, and then I'll take the question. The Ramban, in his commentary in Sefer Mitzvos, the Rambam counts tefillah, davening, every day as a positive commandment, the fifth of the 613 commandments of the Rambam is to daven every single day. And the Ramban disagrees. The Ramban says that it's important to daven every single day, but it's not a positive commandment. However, the Ramban says, be'es tzara, in a time of crisis, at that point, tefillah may very well become a biblical obligation. And he too points to this pasuk, V'chisavo muchama b'artzachem al atzar hatzorereschem b'harayosem b'chatzotzros, as the source. For him, it's not so much midarke hatshuva, although they're not mutually exclusive. It's simply about prayer itself. And the Ramban says that at a time of crisis, that kind of tests our mettle in terms of what we consider to be important, and what takes priority. And he basically says two different things in the sentences that follow. One is that it's important to cultivate belief in the power of prayer. Again, it's not something that we can prove in a concrete and tangible way by definition. But our tradition is that the Ribono Shel Olam hears our prayers, and that he acts, with chesed, and that tefillah can really make a difference. It's not just to make ourselves feel good. It's not just psychological, venting or introspection, but it's really bakashas rachamim. It's really requesting. And, it's certainly not automatic, but if we do so with sincerity and consistently, that is impactful, and meaningful. But in addition to that, the Ramban says that when you are in a time of crisis, if your focus is on your relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam, then it shows that you're truly an eved to that Adam. It's a way of testing, that relationship as well. It's not just a lip service, but in crisis, we turn, to the priorities, of our lives. And for Jews in a time of crisis, looking, to God's intervention and His help is very important, because it establishes what is unique about it. I think there's one other element that I would add to the Ramban, and that is particularly related to what I spoke about before, and I think that what is true in this particular circumstance, and that is when you're dealing with an enemy, that is barbaric and really is just, destructive and evil, and we all knew this before, even if the Western world didn't, but, they'll deny it again in a few days. But at least in the horrific, present, even the organs of Western civilization, are horrified and mortified and scandalized, by the extent of the barbarism. But when we encounter this kind of barbarism, there's an additional factor, I think, in what's so disturbing and what engenders so much anxiety and pain, and that is that you begin to question, in a way, the purpose of life and existence, because our focus, is very much defined by the concept of Tzelem Elokim, by the sanctity of life, and by the faith that we have that human beings, are not just two-legged, animals, conscience, that they have
human
capacity for transcendence, etc. And then when you encounter Hatzara Tzorereschem or Oyevecha, who can perpetrate this kind of barbaric, vicious attack. So in addition to fear and sadness for people that you know and that you've lost, or just for cousins and brothers of Klal Yisrael, etc., there's also this kind of depression, that grabs you, that you like, is this what man is capable of and what he is? Then what's the point really of life and existence? It's the Rambam in the beginning of Hilchos Tainus, I mentioned before, talking about these psukim, says that when you encounter tragedy or crisis, if you say nikra nikra, it's just a coincidence and there's no rhyme or reason for anything. He said that's axarius, that's a vicious approach. It's a very interesting language. We don't usually associate the word axarius, viciousness, with a perspective on hashgacha or mikra, on divine intervention and supervision, or happenstance. You could say this is right and this is wrong, but is it vicious? But in the end of the day, it really is achzari, because if you think that things that happen in the world that happen just coincidentally or without any rhyme or reason, then in another sense you're basically adopting. And this is why this week's parsha of Bereshis is so important. It starts with Bereshis bara Elokim. Ramban says the word Bereshis means yesh me'ayin. It implies a purposeful creator, because if you only believe in the Big Bang, and you don't believe in a borei, and you believe in nikra nikra, then basically man is just a more sophisticated animal. And if that's the case, then the idea that there's a more transcendent purpose for his life is very dubious. But we don't believe that. We believe that there was a creator, is a creator, yesh me'ayin, and that there's purpose, and that man was created b'tselem Elokim, as we read in this coming week's parsha. But then you encounter the kind of viciousness, what man can be capable of, and then you begin to wonder all over again. So implicitly, in addition to the pain and the sense of loss and anger that we have, for this kind of a barbarism, there's kind of a questioning of our purpose, as well. But that's why it's important to engage in tefillah and Talmud Torah. And that's, I think, another point that the Ramban is making. Precisely in a time when we could be, kind of giving up on a purposeful life, when we see what people are capable of and how much pain they can inflict, without any kind of conscience. So attaching ourselves to these, grand ideals, that the halacha presents as, the purpose of our existence, touching the Ribono Shel Olam and living, a structured life that is, based on morals and very, extensive values, in a way, not an antidote, but it's a way of coping, and it's also, in some respects, a response, to what it is that we encounter. So we're going to start Yevamos now, but I just wanted to say at least something, to provide a bit of background and a little bit of direction, maybe, in how why is it learning Torah is so important right now, and tefillah, and in general what we should be focusing on. Yes, I'm sorry, I know you had your hand on.
Rabbi, just very briefly, in times of crisis, we're enjoined to do cheshbon nefesh.
Yeah.
To search as to why certain things are happening and so on. And we've been through a very difficult period in Israel over the past 8 or 9 months.
Right.
Where we can call it divisiveness, bordering on or actually frank sinat chinam. And we know what sinat chinam leads to, and that Hashem frowns, to say the least, upon divisiveness amongst a lack of achdut. And so I appreciate davening to Hashem, but we just this is Ben Adam Lachavero and not Ben Adam Lamakom.
Well, it's
coming out
both,
of
but
Yom Kippur, that basically we've got to kind of fix our own, what's wrong in our own shop. And what's wrong in our own shop, I think we all know, because we've been spending the past year at each other's throats, talking, and not even just figuratively. And I think it incomes upon us, to me, it boils down to Sinat Chinam, that this didn't happen by accident, and why the government was asleep at the switch and so on. I gather we'll find that out later. But as you mentioned earlier, why do these things happen? I mean, it's extraordinary. The whole world said this is the best intelligence service in the world, and they got caught off our guard. Why? Right. We can say, you know, it's Hashem's intervention, but I don't think it was Hashem's intervention. I think we are responsible for that. I don't think there's a Hester Panim, for example, in this particular instance. I don't believe that for 1 second. What I do believe.
I'll answer just very briefly. What I was trying to say before, I mean, the Rambam says that what I mentioned before is that, you know, introspection is the proper response, and introspection is trying to identify areas which we can improve in. I'm just very wary always, you know, there's a tendency, you know, and in the context of, you know, having
find answers to what God does, you know.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, if we had Nevi'im, then we would know exactly, or, you know, because that's their job, they're, you know, giving this kind of insight. We don't, and therefore I think that, you know, people who, you know, identifying things in a very specific way, you know, and being certain, you know, about exactly how it works, can be very useful to others, and it is always speculative. I don't disagree with most of what you just said, so I would just say it in a little bit of a different way, and that is that, of course, the introspection is not just prayer. The introspection requires that we address any you know, lacuna in our behavior, and I think that, you know, if somebody were to look at the recent history in the last year and everything that's gone on, I think everybody would agree that the tone and the, you know, incivility and the extremism on both sides, you know, is something that has definitely divided us, you know, unnecessarily. There can be, again, I don't want to discuss the whole issue. There can be legitimate disagreement, you know, about policies, you know, having to do, you know, with a government, and they can even be very important, and they can even be impassioned. But, you know, the exaggeration of it, you know, on all sides, and the complete, you know, ignoring of the impact that it's had on the social fabric, again, by both sides, in my opinion, is, I think, unconscionable. And, you know, for sure, if there was greater unity and people weren't threatening that they weren't doing miluim and people were focused, I'm sure that could only have helped. What I'd like to avoid is to say it happened because of this, it happened because of that, in a very specific way. I call that spiritual.
I didn't.
No, I understand. I agree with you.
Establish
let me just clarify
relationship.
No, I understand. So what I'm saying is, I want to avoid what I call spiritual scapegoating, because it usually, you know, we have this principle because of our sins.
You know, we should focus more on the fact. I mean, we're an imperfect people. We've always been an imperfect people. We're stiff-necked people. We've always been a stiff-necked people. But if we want to understand the real shame of what took place, it is to some degree not the animals that did these terrible things, but unfortunately, we know from our even recent history that these animals always existed. And unfortunately, what is, I think, the greatest shame is the popular support that still exists to this day. After the fact, I have a friend of mine who went from Tel Aviv to London, and he reported to me that he landed in London. There was a big demonstration. I said, really? Support of Israel? No! While the blood was curdling, babies' heads chopped off, okay? You had thousands demonstrating in the opposite way. Right. I mean, that is the level to which this society has come. Let's call it again. That's a mobble-like status. Okay.
Well, what you're both
generating-
saying, what both of you are saying is true. There's been internal division which has been unnecessary, and there is, again, I alluded to it before. I was talking about Western outlets, media, and cultural, and so on, which I think also is hypocritical and completely unforgivable. But I think the bigger idea is that you talked about Hester Panim. What the point is that when we are what we believe is that when we as individuals and we as a community are behaving in an exemplary fashion, so then the intervention of the Ribono Shel Olam to safeguard us is always greater, and that doesn't mean we're not blaming the Ribono Shel Olam, Chalila, on the contrary. But what we're saying is that there's a lot that needs to be looked at. But my bigger point isn't so much to identify this, that, or the next thing, because that I think can be very speculative.
In summary, this is Amalek.
It's really just to establish that the organs of Torah and of Tefillah as places, as mechanisms that help us identify priorities and values, that becomes a very important exercise and an important also source of unity, but also of direction, if we allow it. And that's really my intention. Okay, so having said that, we're going to proceed to
Somebody
begin the
has their
sheer
mic
part.
on something that's a problem.
Yeah.
I don't know what
Say again?
Somebody has a mic on something.
Henry, please mute your mic. I think you're hearing background noise from your home.
Okay. Well, that's a technical problem. I'm not so good at that.
That takes more skill
Anyways,
than I have.
either way, it's good to see everybody, and I'm glad. Some of you I think may have been in Israel, so I'm glad that you are all safe. And as I say, the learning is dedicated, as a kind of as I say, tefillah and a aspiration, that we should hear better news in the days to come. I think this is going to be a very, according to the Israelis, it's going to be a very long slog, and it's going to be very painful. And we should be prepared, to, employ prayer and Torah study, at least as ways of, doing something constructive, that, is also provides us with perspective. Okay, having said all of that, so let's begin. This year's limud is Masechet Yevamos. I'm going to try not to go over time too much today. Masechet Yevamos begins on a rather strange note. At least I think so. So, does everybody have access to? I probably should have put it here, but I don't know why I didn't. But does everybody have access to Gemara Yevamos, to the Mishnah, first Mishnah in Yevamos?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to read the first Mishnah in Yevamos. Hopefully, you all have access to that. We usually assume that the Masechta is accessible, but we're not live, so. So the first Mishnah in Yevamos is already a little bit complicated, so I'm going to try to simplify what it actually says. But in my opinion, it's an interesting, an intriguing place to begin the Masechta. So the Mishnah says, Chamesh Esrei Nashim, there are 15 women, not real women, categories, in other words. We'll explain in a moment. Potros Tsaroseim, the Tsaros Tsaroseim, Mina Chalitza Umina Yibum, and Sofa Olam. Okay, what this means is as follows. Back in biblical times, as we know, a person could be married to more than one wife. That was from a rabbinic point of view, that was disallowed at a certain point, polygamy. But we already know from the biblical narrative, right? The Avos, many of them had more than one wife. So the background of Yibum, of course, is the story of Yibum is the story of a man who dies, who doesn't leave behind any heirs, any progeny. So he dies without children. And the issue of Yibum, which we'll be discussing, is the Yibum means the obligation of his brother, one of his brothers, right, to marry or to pick up, the relationship that he had with his wife, or if there were more than one wife, with one of the wives. So, for example, if there were multiple brothers and multiple wives, let's say there's a Reuven, Shimon, and Levi and Yehuda. Let's say there are 4 brothers, and let's say Reuven, who died, had 3 wives. Okay, so there are 3 candidates for Yibum on the wife's side, because Reuven had 3 wives, and let's say Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda are the 3 brothers who are still alive. They are candidates, to step into their brother's position and to do the act of Yibum. Sometimes there's only one wife, like in modern Yibum cases, there's only one wife. Sometimes in practice, there's only one brother. But in theory, there is, the possibility of multiple brothers and multiple wives. That can make things a little bit complicated in terms of the cases. So just try to bear with me. This will be a common challenge. I don't think it's a problem, but we'll always try to cut through the cases in order to identify the legal issues involved. Anyways, so in a typical Yibum case, you have, an obligation that devolves upon a living brother, right, to step in, if you will, to the marriage of his deceased brother. And what we also need to explain, of course, is that, if it isn't the circumstances of Yibum, then a relationship with a sister-in-law, with the wife of a brother, is one of the arayos. It's one of the illicit relationships, is not allowed. So what we're really contemplating in Yibum, what we're requiring in Yibum, is an exception to the rule of Iser Eshes Ach, the prohibition of the wife of a brother. That is being set aside. I'm going to use that word for the moment. It doesn't legally necessarily capture what's going on. That is being overridden or set aside by the urgency of lahakim la'achiv, shame b'Yisrael. So we're going to read the psukim inside in just a minute. But what happens if the candidates for Yibum, let's say, in addition to being, that's what we're talking about, a sister-in-law, meaning the wife of a brother, let's say there's also another relationship, in that mix. So, for example, let's take a simple example. Legally, I'm not suggesting this, but halachically, it is permissible for a person to marry their niece, meaning the daughter of a brother, is somebody who is a potential, wife. A person can't marry their aunt, but they can marry their niece. Okay. So let's say the following scenario were to happen. So Reuven marries his brother Shimon's daughter. Okay. Reuven marries his niece. Then Reuven dies. Let's say it this way. Reuven marries his niece, Shimon's daughter, and he also has another wife who's just, not related in any other way to anybody else. So he has 2 wives. So now, when Reuven dies without having any kind of children, so Shimon becomes a candidate to do Yibum meaning to step in place of Reuven. But there are two wives here, two candidates. One is Reuven's niece, otherwise known as Shimon's daughter, right? And the other is somebody, just a sister-in-law. So obviously Shimon, the brother who's alive, cannot marry. He cannot be miyabim his daughter, his own daughter, right? She's not a sister-in-law. She's a sister-in-law and a daughter, right? So that obviously is a yibum that can never take place. However, the Mishnah says more. The Mishnah says that under those conditions, this is actually an argument between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. In the Mishnah later on, it becomes apparent that Beis Shammai disagrees with Beis Hillel, but Beis Hillel's view is that if there is an erva in the candidate pool of Yibum, like I just said, in other words, Shimon is facing, his daughter, right, and some other woman. So what Beis Shammai say is, obviously he can't marry his daughter. That would be obscene. But what he can do is he can marry the other candidate. The other candidate, by the way, I spoke about, because I was talking about the situation, al-hatzar hatzorer. I said that a tsar is sometimes a rival, right? That's how it's sometimes translated. In the context of Yibum, we're talking about chamesh esrei nashim potros soroseim. If there's more than one wife, then the sorority of wives, if you want to call it that, the group is called Soros, because they're rivals. They're rival wives. They're co-wives. Okay. So the Chiddush of Beis Hillel is that if there is an erva in the mix of the co-wives, then all of them are excluded from Yibum. There is no Yibum at all. Meaning, not only can he not marry his daughter, that part seems obvious, but he cannot marry his daughter's rival, the other wife of his brother, either. So that's what these words mean. Chamesh esrei nashim, there are 15 categories. I gave the example of daughter. It could be daughter, could be mother-in-law. Let's say my mother-in-law, right, it sounds funny, but my mother-in-law is married to my brother. Is that possible? Sure. It's not commonplace, but just as your daughter being married to your brother is not commonplace. So let's say your mother-in-law is married to your brother. So again, your relationship to your mother-in-law, that's an illicit relationship. That's an erva. So if there's more than one wife, if they're co-wives, then all of them become excluded from you. That's what this Mishnah means in Bikitzur. Chamesh esrei nashim, 15 wives, 15 categories, in other words. Daughter, mother-in-law, we'll see in a moment. Potros, exempt sorosehem, they're rivals. I mean, not only are they exempt from Yibum and Chalitza, but they also exempt their rivals. The tsorosehem, we're not going to get into that at the moment, or even if it's the rivals of the rivals, let's say if there's more than one Yibum happening, but I'm not going to complicate that at the moment. Mina Chalitza umina Yibum, the principle of what we call Zika, the bond that exists between the wife of the deceased brother and the candidate or candidates, plural, for Yibum is called Zika. The word Zika in Hebrew means a strong kesher, a strong connection. So the point is that the presence of erva in the mix exempts the Zika, which means there's no possibility of Yibum, and there's no need either for Chalitza, right, which is normally the alternative to Yibum. Ad Sofa Olam. The Elohein, and here they what's the list of arayos that whose presence in the mix or in the candidate pool of wives excludes everyone. So here's the list. Bito. I mean, these are all cases where the living brother has a erva relationship to one of the candidates, even though that candidate was perfectly permissible to his brother, who subsequently died. So Elaine Bito or Bas Bito, let's say his granddaughter is married to his brother. Right, a little odd, but that is a legal relationship. Or Bas Beno or Bas Ishto. Bas Ishto means he has that's a stepchild. It's the daughter of his wife. Let's say he's married to a woman.
With the daughter already.
What?
She came into the marriage with the daughter.
No, he has a stepdaughter. So his stepdaughter is married to his brother, and then his brother dies. So now he is faced with a stepdaughter in the pool, in the candidate pool of Yibum, or Bas Bina, or Bas Bita, or the daughter of the grandchild, stepchild, or Chamoso, his mother-in-law, or Aim Chamoso, his grandmother-in-law, Aim Chamiv, or the mother of his father-in-law, meaning his grandmother-in-law through his father-in-law. Again, some of the age discrepancies obviously would make this peculiar also, but it doesn't matter. These are abstract. They could happen. They're rare cases. Doesn't matter. It's a legal category. Or a choso me'imo. Let's say he has a sister from his mother's side. So let's say his sister from his mother's side marries his brother. Let's say his brother doesn't share the same mother. So it's not his brother's sister. It's only his sister, meaning Reuven and Shimon. So Shimon's sister from his mother's side marries Reuven, who has a different mother, right? So basically, in some sense, right, Reuven is married to Shimon's sister, but it's not his sister, right? But now that that Reuven dies, so now Shimon is confronted, with a sister, albeit from the mother, who is a candidate, or Achos Imo, his aunt, from his mother's side, or Achos Ishta, let's say a sister-in-law. Let's say you have two brothers, and they marry two sisters. That happens all the time, right? So you have two brothers. I know brothers who have married sisters. I don't think it's so common, but I know of cases, and it's perfectly, legal. That way you get the same mechutin, twice. So you have two brothers, they married two sisters, but the problem is that now, when the first brother died, so one of the wives that is Omedes Liyibum L'chalitza is his double sister-in-law. She is the wife of his brother, which is a typical Yibum situation, but she's also the sister of his wife. Right, there are two types of sister-in-laws.
And Bechayim, she can marry. He can marry her.
Exactly, and correct. So as long as the other sister is alive, and his wife, he can't marry, two sisters. Yaakov Avinu was able to marry two sisters. The Ramban says that's only because he married them outside of Eretz Yisrael.
By the way, just a thought that entered my mind. At the time of the death of the brother, there's two sisters. If before he can do Yibum, his own wife dies, is he allowed to do Yibum with the sister? Because
that's a good question. That depends. Yeah, we'll discuss that, because the question also is when do the Dine Yibum, is it Nisuin?
The Kukas right away. But the question,
so that's a question,
because
because at the time, if she only died after,
but
we'll see in a moment.
The zikuk happens right away.
If she divorced him or died before, it wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, but the reason I would think that he can't do it is because since the zikuka, the attachment occurs immediately upon death.
The zika, right. 100%.
So we would assume that everything applies at the moment of death.
Yeah, so we'll discuss that, whether that's true or not, but that is a good question. That's an important question. Or Eishes Achiv Me'imo. Eishes Achiv Me'imo is, again, his his sister-in-law, but from his mother's side, not a brother from his mother's side, not from.
In the common denominator, these are all Doraisa ervos specifically outlined in the Torah.
Yes, these are all Doraisa ervas. Most of them in Parshas Achremos, which we read on Yom Kippur. Some in Kedoshim. Then you have two more. Eshes Achiv Shelo Haya B'Olamo. I'm going to explain that in a second. And Kalaso. Kalaso is easy. That's a daughter-in-law. It's interesting that Kalaso is the last one mentioned in the Mishnah, but Kalaso is a daughter-in-law. So let's say that his daughter-in-law, right, the woman that was married to his son, is now married to his brother. So the son and the daughter-in-law divorced, let's say. So that woman who used to be his daughter-in-law married his brother, but she still was his daughter-in-law, right? So that's Kalaso. What is Eshes Achiv Shelo Haya B'Olamo? So this is a little tricky. So as we'll see, there's an interesting requirement in Yibum, but this is different than all other cases, in the Mishnah. And that what it means is, let's say there are three brothers. Doesn't have to be three even. We can make it easier. Rashi has a case of three. Let's take, if we don't have to fit it into the Mishnah, and I can just illustrate it, it's easier with two. Let's say Ruvain, and there's Ruvain, and he's married, right? And he dies. And when he dies, he has no brother. But the brother is born after he dies.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, his parents
Still giving birth to
or at least
kids.
his father
Long enough to make another baby.
has a child, who was born.
Zikuna.
That's not so unusual. After Ruvain dies, and then Shimon is born.
זה מקרה של
And
יהודה.
Ruvain leaves a wife or
It
wives.
even become another wife so long as it's a paternal brother, right?
Yes. So basically,
Not exactly, he was too young.
that's called Achiv,
יהודה ותמר.
Eshes Achiv Shelo Haya B'Olamo. That's called. Meaning the wife of a brother who wasn't in the world when he
After
was.
he died.
Okay. So this comes from the pasuk, which we're going to discuss in just a couple of minutes. The first, the introductory words of Parshas Yibum in Parshas Tzitetse are Ki Yeshvu Achim Yachtav. When brothers live together. We're going to discuss that in just a minute. It's a peculiar way for the parsha to begin. But the limud, the Gemara says in Yevamos here, and the Sifrei, that what we derive from the words Ki Yeshvu Achim Yachtav, when brothers live together, is that in order for Yibum to apply, it has to be Achiv Shahaya Be'olamo. It has to be a brother who was born, while the other brother was
The new
alive.
kid doesn't have an obligation.
Even though, if we could, I guess, try to mute her or whatever. If the, we're talking about a full brother, it could be, father and mother are identical. So basically, what we're really talking about is somebody whose DNA is that of a brother completely, right? But in practice, this brother was born after the first brother deceased. So in that circumstance, there's no yibum. And if that's if the wife of that brother is encountered in a yibum context, let's say that's why you have to go a little more complicated. So let's say there are three brothers. Okay, Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi. Let's say Ruvain and Shimon coexisted, and Levi was born after Ruvain died. But Levi was already born, before Shimon died. So let's say Ruvain dies. He leaves a wife. He leaves two wives. One wife doesn't make a difference. He leaves a wife. Levi cannot be miyabim because that's achiv shelo. He's achiv shelo yabolamo. However, let's say then Shimon. So Shimon does the yibum, and now Shimon is married to the wife of Ruvain through yibum, and then Shimon, who has another wife, so now he has two wives. then Shimon dies. Now Levi is a candidate to be miyabim, the second wife
Like number two.
of, or maybe the first wife of Shimon, because that's a regular Yibum situation. He was alive
Right.
at that time, right? However, since part of the pool of rivals of the sorority of wives, let's say, also includes a woman who was excluded from a previous potential Yibum because she was Eshes Achiv Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, that will disqualify also her tzara even through a different marriage, even through the marriage of Shimon. Everybody with me? You don't have to follow the cases completely. The principle, hopefully, is clear. And the principle, therefore, is that if there are multiple candidates, for Yibum, but even one of those candidates is disqualified because, in addition to being a sister-in-law, an Eshes Ach, they are also some other erva. So then the consequence is not only to exclude that candidate, it excludes the whole group. That's a very big chiddush. Beis Shammai doesn't agree. Beis Shammai says we exclude the daughter, we exclude the mother-in-law, we exclude the sister from the mother. But why should we exclude the other candidates? That's we paskin like Beis Hillel. We say that the presence of an erva in the pool, in the candidate list of Yibum, is something that disqualifies the entire group. And that's why the Mishnah lists 14 ervas, and the 15th is actually, or the 14th of the 15th, is something a little different. That's Achiv Shelo Haya Bi'olamo. In a way, that's a bigger chiddush, because it's not an erva. She's not anymore. She's a regular Eshes Ach. She's not his sister, and she's not his daughter, and she's not his granddaughter, she's not his mother-in-law, right? So, what's the big deal? But the answer is, since there's no possibility of Yibum, so she is, it's as if, the way Rashi puts it, based on the Gemara, it's as if she is, his sister-in-law with a brother who had children. That would be an erva. The only reason that it's not an Yibum is because there are no children, right? So that's the Mishnah. That's what the Mishnah says, that Harei elu potros tsaroseim v'tsaros tsaroseim min hachalitza min hayibum ad sof ha'olam. However, and this goes to your question a moment ago about timing, the kulan emesu o mianu o nisgarshu o nimsu ailanis tsaroseim mutaros. On the other hand, if it's not really accurate, but if the problematic wife, the one who was an erva in the pool, the daughter, the mother-in-law, the sister from the mother, if she's no longer part of the, sorority of wives because there was a divorce that excluded her already before the husband died. Before Ruvain died, he divorced his niece. Before Ruvain died, he divorced his brother's mother-in-law. Before Ruvain died, he divorced his brother's granddaughter. He can marry all of them. If he hadn't divorced them, or they hadn't died, one or the other, then they would have disqualified the entire group. But if before he dies, they're out of the picture, either because they died or because he divorced them, or it turns out that there was some problem and it was a mekaktos, the whole marriage was based on a false premise, etc. So even though it might look like they're part of the pool of Yibum candidates, since in fact they were not before the moment of Yibum. So the result of that is that the tsaros, the other wives, all of whom are qualified for Yibum because they're not erva beyond being sisters-in-law, Eshes Ach, all of them would be perfect candidates for Yibum. That's what the first Mishnah says.
Say before that if he had a daughter-in-law who then married his brother, which means she was no longer his daughter-in-law, but she obviously got divorced, that would create a situation where there wouldn't be a tzara, that he wouldn't be, that everybody would be freed from Yibum. So why is this case different?
Because the fact that she is not connected still to his son is an issue that determines the relationship between the Yavam candidate and the woman and whether they have an illicit relationship or not. And in the case of Kala, it doesn't matter. Once she was married to his son, that has a status of Kalaso no matter what.
But I'm saying, why would that not?
Yeah, no, I understand your question. Just give me 1 second. I think it's a really good question, but the answers also should be clear. There, the death or the divorce or whatever it is, let's say the son dies, it doesn't make a difference because there's still a prohibition in terms of the relationship between the Yavam or the would-be Yavam and the woman, meaning his former daughter-in-law is still prohibited to him.
Forever.
In the other case, what the Mishnah was saying is something a little different, even though it's parallel. That's why it's good that you asked it. The Mishnah is saying something else. Even the Mishnah wants to know, is this woman in the mix relative to the Tsaros? Is she one of the group? So what we're saying is, if there was a divorce, or if the problematic, co-wife died before the husband died, so she's just not in the mix because, as you said yourself, in a different context, the critical moment is when he dies. So the fact that she used to be in the mix, is not relevant. The fact that she used to be his daughter-in-law, let's say, still makes her prohibited to him. But the fact that she used to be one of the wives of his brother that is not an enduring relationship beyond divorce or death. You understand? Okay. This is a little complicated, I will admit. We're not finished with this. The bigger question I want to ask is as follows. We don't need to read the rest of the Mishnah. It basically just repeats everything that we just said. Is this a good place to begin Masechet Yevamos?
First, there should be an explanation of what is the Yavam.
Rabbi, I wanted to address that, if I might.
Say again?
I was trying to get a question in, and Andy's been getting a minute. I wanted to ask a question. The whole idea of Yibum, I think we all know it in the class, and you didn't specify this earlier, is if the brother dies childless.
Yes.
So what if you have a man who marries 2 wives,
right,
has a child with one of them, but doesn't have children with the second wife?
Doesn't
matter. Is the Yibum doesn't apply here? Or the second wife still
only applies if the deceased husband, brother, doesn't have children. If he has any children from any wife, then there's no Yibum. It's lahakim la'achiv shem b'Yisrael. He has no heirs, no progeny. Yeah. Okay. So my question is this: is this the right place to start Masechet Yevamos? Meaning, what's the alternative? Very simple. Wouldn't you need a Mishnah to tell you, the basics of Yibum? What's the relationship between Yibum and Chalitza, which is later on a debate, discussion. Are Yibum and Chalitza equal alternatives, or is Yibum preferred over Chalitza, or Chalitza over Yibum? That's a good place to start the Masechta. Better than that, if you look in everybody has the Marmakomos that we sent out, I'm hoping.
We do.
So what? I'm assuming
I said
yes?
we have, and we printed them out before.
Okay, great. So if you look at the second to last page, you'll see Talmud Babli Masechet Kiddushin Daf Beis Amud Aleph. Everybody have that? What is it, page?
Page
8?
7, I think.
Or 7?
Next to last page, I think, is 7.
Next to last, yeah. On the bottom of the page, it says Talmud Babli Masechet Kiddushin Daf Beis Amud Aleph. Okay, that's a Mishnah in the beginning of Masechet Kiddushin. Masechet Kiddushin begins pretty logically. There are 3 ways to accomplish Kiddushin. We've seen it before. There are 2 ways for a woman to extricate herself from Ishas, right? Nikas bekesef b'shtar b'bia. There are three ways to accomplish kiddushin. Then the Mishnah discusses how much kesef. Beishami amar b'dinar, b'shav b'dinar, beisilom b'pruta, b'shav b'pruta, kama hi pruta, echad nishmona b'isar italki. And then how do you extricate yourself from a marriage? Konas atzma beget, through a divorce, something we discussed a lot last year. Uba misa sabal, or if the husband dies, that's the end of the marriage. And then the Mishnah concludes, hayivama, niknes b'bia, that yibum is accomplished through the physical relationship of the parties. The kones atzma b'chalitza, and to end the zika rather than to fulfill it, right? You have to do chalitza. Uba misas hayavam, or if there's only one yavam, and if he dies, so there are no more candidates, so there's no more zika. So I'm just giving you an example. Ironically, the first Mishnah in Kiddushin, which is about Kiddushin, A, is a good model, and B, even in the tochen, even in the substance, it directly addresses. It's a good introduction for Yibum, not just for Kiddushin. It's not just suggestive of what might be in Yibum. You know, the first Mishnah in Kiddushin is a far more typical introduction to Yevamos than the first Mishnah in Yevamos is. There are Mishnayos in Yevamos, I said, that discuss, what's preferable, Yibum or Chalitza, how do you do Yibum? Let's say, is it to Bal Korcha de Yevama or
We
not?
have many
Let's say.
Masechtas that start like way. Masechtas Brachos, they asked a similar question,
Right.
And several other Masechtas, we have the same question, why the first perk starts like.
So again, methodologically, I mean, there could be many reasons, why. Last year I asked the same question about Gittin. Like, what is Gittin? We started our study of Masechet Gittin in the very end with the last Mishnah on Daf Tzadi. Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, Rabbi Kiva, Matzah B'Erev Davar.
Right.
But then when we finally got to the first Mishnah, took a little bit, which is about B'fanei Nachta, B'fanei Nachta. I raised the question also there, like, why not start with the, with.
It's not so unusual.
Again, there can be more than one answer, and there could be technical explanations. But as you point out, Rishonim ask these questions, like Tosin Moed Katan and Bava Kama, other places say, like, why do you begin the Masechta with this particular mission? Tosin Shabbos discusses why we begin Masechet Shabbos with Yitzias HaShabbos.
Was this following Rabbi's choice? I mean, did this go back to Rabbi Yehuda?
Oh, yeah, but no, so that just kicks the can down. Like, well, why did Rebbe choose this?
Yeah, no, but
What do you have in mind?
Gemara
What does he
sort of
benefit from?
had to follow Rebbe, no?
Yeah, but what was the initial thinking? There are actually two interesting questions, to ask. One is, why does the Masechta begin? But here we're beginning in the middle. We're not even beginning with details of Yibum or the background. We're beginning an exception to Yibum, and an interesting, I think it's part of the answer, but I'll leave that for next week. An interesting argument between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, whether the presence of an erva in the candidate pool of Yibum also disqualifies otherwise acceptable candidates. That's a very interesting argument, but that sounds like we're starting in the middle. We're talking about the exception to Yibum, and we're talking about a very interesting, but a very intricate, legal point. So is that really the place to start? A parallel question, which Rishonim also discuss, and we talked about, again, the parallel of this last year as well, is the order of Masechtas, right? So last year we talked about, why Gittin is before Kiddushin in many of the systems, not in all. So you should also be aware, like in the Rambam's arrangement of Mishnayos, the first Mishnah, the first Masechta in Seder Nashim is Yevamos. That's what we have. We follow that. If you look at any Gemara, any Mishnayos, the first Masechta in Nashim is Yevamos. But the Meiri,
counterintuitive because you not only need a Kedushin, But to understand the Yibum, you'd have to understand Gittin also, because
Right. I mean, it's very counterintuitive because, as you say, it's first of all, it's a very rare case. How many Yibum cases are there?
and a good deal of Yivamis talks
Number
about
two,
whether it should be a get or Yibum, whether you need both, a get or Yibum,
yeah, we're going to get to that in a second as well. So again, it's a strange choice. I mean, the Rambam says something interesting, but I find it curious also. The Rambam says in Pirush Mishayos, and the Rambam discusses this question in his, he has a very famous, extensive introduction to Mishnayos, Akdama Mishnah. So there he discusses this question. We discussed last year his take on the Gittin and Kedushin and the Yatzav Haisa, the order in the Psukim. So here he says something curious. Here he says, why Yevamos is first? It's because it's Balkarcha the Vama. It's like a right. It's not a voluntary kinyan. That's strange that should determine the order. We'll talk about the principle at a later point, but I wanted to add the Meiri, just a second. The Meiri in Brachos and in Yevamos mentions that there was a different arrangement. I mean, some Rishonim had Seder Nashim beginning with Kiddushin, or Ksuvas, then Kiddushin, then Gittin, and then Yevamos. Obviously, that makes more sense. But either way, we're going to get back. The Tosas Yeshanim, in the beginning of the Masechta, the first Tosas Yeshanim in the Masechta addresses this question. Like if you look at, where did I put my Gemara? If you have a Shas Gemara there, you can just look on the left side of that base of an Aleph, and we'll end in a couple of minutes.
And there is a thought that's, I think, brought up that Zika is God sent, so to speak. So it has a higher level of connection. In other words, the Zika is established, so to speak, from the halacha that Hashem brought down. So maybe it has a precedence of a man-made Kiddushin and Gittin.
Okay. I mean, it's like Hikner lo min hashamayim. To use the language that the Rambam likes. Hikner lo min hashamayim. Maybe. And with the Tosas Shanim has asked this question, Yesh Makshim, like the Rambam, Amai matchil Seder Nashim b'Yevamos. And then he adds, Ha'atchule puranusa lo matchalina. Usually we don't start on a sad note, try to avoid sad topics. Sadly, sometimes we're confronted with them and we don't have the luxury. But, if given the choice, we'd rather speak about happier things. Yibum always is in a context of, of a tragedy, of somebody who dies early. The Adarabah, Havle Lahatchil Kiddushin, Iksuvos, the Gittin, the Achakakivamos. So I'm not going to tell you what he says right now because we'll get back to it. But I'm just trying to show that both the choice of the first Mishnah and the choice of Yevamos and Seder Nashim is something that requires our attention. But in order to answer this or to give you my take on it, we need to address another question. And since our time is almost up, I'm just going to briefly look at the Psukim and then we'll analyze them next week. So look on page 1 of the Marmakomos. The institution of Yibum and Chalitza appears in Parshas Kitetse. Okay? That's also where Gittin and Kiddushin, by the way, was found. But before we even read any psukim, let me mention something I think is, again, curious. And when you multiply anomalies or curiosities, you might be, onto something. So let me mention this one as well. Gittin and Kiddushin are spoken of in Parshas Kitetse, as we discussed last year. And so is Parshas Yibum. So I would have thought, if somebody told me that, I would have assumed that they would be contiguous parshios. because they're all dealing, with the grand institutions of Ishus. Then I would have looked at the order also, in light of what we asked about, the Mishnayos. But what's fascinating is you have Gittin and Kiddushin, and Matsu Grishasa, what we talked about last year, for those who were here. And then you have like several psukim that talk about totally different topics. Very challenging for the Mefarshim ala Torah to explain, what the connection is between Gittin and Kiddushin and some of the topics that follow, but quite a number of topics until you get to Yibum, meaning there's a hefsek, if you will, an interruption between the Parsha of Gittin v'Kiddushin and the Parsha of Yibum. And it seems intentional because, again, it's very, very challenging to figure out why those other Parshios should be in between. So in Parshas Kitetse, where you have both of these Parshios, the Torah, I would say, intentionally separates them, maybe because Yibum is a huge rule breaker. Everything about Yibum is rule breaker. But I think our task is to try to figure out whether the rule breaking, is just that. It's, a totally different, contrary, considerations, etc., or whether the rule breaking isn't also, in some respects, a kiyum, a fulfillment, a reinforcement of some of the bigger ideas of Ishus itself. And that's really one of the things that we're going to be pursuing all year. To what extent is Yibum? It's certainly technically, is an exception and a rule breaker. To what extent conceptually is it that or the opposite? Does it tell you profound things about Ishus and marriage? The more you think, that it is basically a way of testing certain principles, about Ishus itself, the more you could justify, why does it Yevamos maybe is the perfect candidate to be the first Masechta in Nashim. What?
That relate to the machlokas of the Chuya?
Yes, I think it does, but on more than a technical level. So again, in the legal issue, this is sometimes broadly called hutra and dechuya. Hutra means, we'll go the other way. Dechuya means that there is like a rule, but sometimes you have to violate a rule because there's a greater urgency. That's why I was trying to be careful language before.
Is it out of place?
Override. The idea of dechuya is overriding. So here the principle would be as follows. I mean, what is the problem here? There's an Yisrei Shesach. And normally that's an egregious erva and a violation of Kedushas Isha.
Kalosa would not apply because it has chorus.
And well, so that's the question, the whole sugya of Asidokalosa say in the beginning of Yevamos. But the point is that is it dechuya? Is the Torah teaching us that the greater urgency of lahakim la'achiv shem b'Yisrael, of ensuring the continuity or a legacy, we'll call it. We'll discuss what it means going forward, of this person. Does that override the erva of Eshesach? Or is it hutra? Hutra means it's more of an internal thing, meaning the prohibition of Eshesach was never said in the conditions of Yibum. That's technically what hutra means. So you're not violating in a justified way because of a greater good. What you're doing is you are taking like a more profound, approach to all of the factors, and then figuring out that internally, right, the right thing to do here
It doesn't apply to you at all.
So it's not that you violated, legally and necessarily. You didn't violate at all. But if you want to go even further, what I call super hutra, is the idea that, what makes Eshesach such an egregious violation also makes Yibum such a mitzvah. So it isn't just that legally you're not considered to be violating, it's not justified violation. That for sure not. It's more than that. In a way, the very reason that there's an Isra Shesach typically is the very reason that there is a mitzvah of Yibum, in this particular circumstance. In which case, Yibum it is a rule breaker on a technical level, and that's maybe why it's divided from the presentation of Gittin v'Kiddushin, but it's not against the rules of Ishus because of a bigger overriding, pressure. It actually is a window into, in a very subtle way, into what Kedushas Ishus is really all about. So that's really what we're looking for. So the first thing to note is the separation of the parshias. The second thing to note is the formulation of the psukim. We're just going to food for thought, and we're going to stop. So first of all, the Torah begins, Ki yeshvu achim yachtav. Right? Let's read the psukim. Ki yeshvu achim yachtav, when brothers live together. That's very peculiar. Normally, we would have expected, the Meshech Chochmah has this comment. He says, we would have expected that just like in Nachala and other parshios, the Torah wants to describe the circumstance. What do you mean, Ki yeshvu achim yachtav? It should start, Ish meis ve'ein lo ben, just like very similar to Yerusha, the parsha of Nachla, of inheritance, right? The man dies, he has a child, he doesn't have a child. What happens? Instead, you have this amorphous, Ki yeshvu achim yachtav. It all sounds very, rhapsodic, but, very tranquil, very harmonious. It's intended to, so we'll get to that. But what a strange beginning. Umeis echad mehem. It's almost like, it doesn't matter which one of them died, but one of them died. It's also peculiar. Speak about somebody specific who died. What do you mean? There's a group of brothers, they live together, one of them died. Why not just say, a man died and he has no children and he has brothers. That's what we would have expected. Ki yeshu achim yachtav, what does it even mean when brothers live together? So the Ibn Ezra and others, are challenged. They say, what do you mean? They have to live together? They have to live in the same town? They have to be speaking to each other? What's ki yeshu? But of course, the drasha in the Gemara Yevamot, and this is key, this is the source for the number 14 of the 15 ervas of the Mishnah, which was achiv shelo haya ba'olamo. How do we know that if a brother was born after the other brother was deceased, that there's no yibum, even though he's a brother in DNA in every other way, just that, they didn't coexist in the world at the same time? How do we know that din? From the words, ki yeshvu achim yachtav. So let me ask you, this unusual case, within Yibum is unusual, right? And within Yibum, how typical is it that you're going to get achim, or an ach shelo haya ba'olamo, right? Very atypical, very rare. But those are the first words that the Torah uses for Yibum, is the first thing that the Torah wants to hint to you, and the reason that they don't start in a more obvious way is in order to establish the din, the rare din, the puzzling din of achiv shelo haya ba'olamo. That's very strange. Let's continue with the pasuk for a minute. I'm not even going to read the second pasuk. Hopefully we'll get to that next time. We're not finished with the first pasuk by a long shot. But let me just go through the other problems, and I'll tell you what I think generally is going on here, and then we'll pursue it. So, uben enlo, he doesn't have a child. It doesn't mean a son. It means any child. Son, daughter, grandchild, whatever, no progeny. But listen to the language. Lotia Eshes Hames. First of all, she's called Eshes Hames, the wife of the deceased. The Mishnah says in Kiddushin, V'kones atzma beget ubemisa sabal. She's not the Eshes Hames. I mean, she was the wife of this person when he was alive. She's the wife of the deceased. But that's what Zika is. So in a way, the Torah seems to be saying that on some level, unless it just means it's just a way of describing, the relationship. She was the wife of the man who is now dead. Or are we saying, no, she is, she's the wife of the dead man, Hoved, legally. That is something that raises the question of what we mean by kones atzma misabal, or at least in a situation where, there's no closure because there's no heir, right? Or no. Either way, the phrase Esha Sameis is very intriguing. And then to the
5 minutes.
Hachutza leish zar.
Okay.
We don't want her to be on the outside, alienated, and having to, reestablish her life with an ish zar. Ish zar is a strong term. Like, we know a zar, like a Kohen can do the avoda, and a zar, is a foreigner. He has no business, in the Beis Hamikdash doing the avoda. So if we don't connect her to one of the brothers, Sheyashvu Imo Yachdav, right, we're throwing her a hakutza and putting her at the mercy of an ish zar. It's just very inflammatory language. And then the Torah says, Yavama, right, sister, Yavo Aleha, clearly these are Yavama, Yavo, Lekachalo Leisha, by which Chazal understood that once there's Yibum, she becomes his wife, and she would require a get if they were going to end that marriage, not a chalitza. In other words, if there's a Yibum, she becomes his wife fully. So that's an interesting question. Is there a chalos ishus shel Yibum after the action, or she then becomes completely lekachalo leisha, but then it says v'yibma. What does v'yibma mean? So there are two opposite meanings of v'yibma in the Mefarshim. One is, and he fulfills his obligation of Yibum, or as a Yavam. And others say, like the Chizkuni and the Sfarno and so on, they say, oh, it's one of those words which means the opposite. Which means itself and the opposite. Like, Kadesha, Kedusha, Lisharesh, means either to root or to uproot. So they interpret Yavo Aleo Lekachalo Isha V'Yibma, and he undoes, her status as Yibum. So
Yeah.
the point I'm trying to make is the whole first pasuk is extraordinarily difficult to read, very suggestive language. The second pasuk is equally challenging. I'm just not going to get into it. Let me just tell you what I think is going on. So I think that the Torah begins Ki Yeshvu Achim Yachtav, and with the rare, but I think symbolically significant rule of Achiv Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, because I think in those words and in that strange halacha, the Torah encapsulates a principle about ishus generally that is, at the center of the institution of Yibum. And that is that when a person gets married, it's not just a bond, between husband and wife. It really is, right, a merging of the families. And as such, the background for Yibum is Ki Yeshvu Achim Yachtav, and it doesn't matter. There's no focus on the individual. It's Umeis Echad Mehem. It doesn't really matter. This is all about the broader principle of brotherhood, of Achva. I'll try to show that. And because of that, at least structurally, there has to have been the potential of a relationship, between these two brothers. So that the first words that we read about Yibum is that the background is, she's not marrying only an individual, she's marrying into a brotherhood. And that has repercussions for her, but also for them in terms of responsibility. Again, Rav Hirsch, in his commentary, in a bunch of places, Bereshis and the end of Noach and Lech Lecha and in Yisro, probably in other places as well, has a terrific, insight. Not sure if he's the first to say this or not. That is that a chassan and a kala, which is the way that we designate a bride and a groom, or groom and a bride, in Hebrew really mean a son-in-law and a daughter-in-law, right? A kala is really a daughter-in-law, and a chatan is a son-in-law. And as if to say, when you marry someone,
Right, a family.
you marry a family, and you're becoming a son-in-law, and she's becoming a daughter-in-law. Maybe that's the most challenging part of it. I don't know. But it in some respects, it certainly is. But it isn't just background, and history. There are repercussions in terms of family. So the first thing that we're told about Yibum is Ki Yeshvu Achim Yachdav. And that limits to Achim Shelo Haya Bolamo. And for that reason, if we were to just ignore her, and let her move on, without offering, let's say, or at least ideally, the sanctuary of this family, or if we were to ignore, the absence of a complete legacy, for the deceased brother, that would be the equivalent of treating. There is an element of Eishes Hameis. You have to understand the scope of it. Just because he died, if it was only a one-on-one relationship, I thou, whatever you want to call it, then if one of them dies, there's no more. It takes two to have a relationship. But if there are family aspects to the relationship itself, then some of them transcend death, especially when there are no heirs. So she is really Eishes Hameis. If you were to, just abandon her and forget about the Zika, it would be Hachutza, and any other candidate without resolving the Zika would be in the category of Ishzar. So therefore, there's an interesting dialectic of being a Yibo, a Yavam, but L'kachalo Isha, thereby extricating her from being a Yavam, or fulfilling her from being a Vama, or fulfilling her being a Yavama, the Yibma, in both of its meanings. So I think the first pasuk already establishes a wider framework, which goes way beyond the narrow consideration, of lahakim la'achiv shem b'Yisrael, and understands even that, which we'll elaborate on, in a much bigger way, not as some extraneous, urgent, overriding factor, but more as an aspect of that is implicit in marriage to begin with, and which in this particular set of circumstances, requires, a different approach. Okay, so that we'll get back to what that has to do with the Mishnah, but we will continue next time in Ritz Hashem with these psukim and some of the themes that we find in the Mefarshim about Yibum, and then we'll get back to the Mishnah and other things as well. Okay, so I wish you all a good week. It's good to start the shir again. We should all, relating to what I started with, we should try, obviously, to assist and be constructive in a tangible and concrete way, any way that we can through this terrible time and crisis. But in addition, it's important to know that, tefillah and Talmud Torah and anything that strengthens our sense of identification with our Eretz Yisrael and population there, and with our relationship to the Rebbeinu Shalom is also very important, and it's part of.
Help us in the.
It's also part of a perspective that allows us to navigate very difficult times and to do so, in a constructive way. So
Amen.
all good, well, and we should hopefully hear better tidings.
Amen. Thank you so
Please
much.
God, next week this mess will be over and we'll be able to
Oh.
feel better.
1 second, don't you should leave. I have a wedding I believe I have a wedding next week. I have to check again. So there'll be actually no share next week. I have a great niece's. Sounds like a complicated Mishnah and Yevamos, but I have a great niece's wedding next week. So I'll try to be in touch with the office. I'm going to double check just to make sure I have the date correct. So next week there'll be a break. I'm sorry about that. I just, we talked about Ki Yeshu Achim Yachtov and larger family responsibilities. So I'm trying to be consistent with that. I'm a big believer in family and an extended family. So likely there's no share next week. I'll ascertain, 100%.
Sheila will let us know.
Yeah, and then
Sheila
we
let us
will
know.
continue in 2 weeks, and we should be going forward at least normally until the end of November, where I have something else scheduled, but we'll see what happens with that. Okay, so just be aware that there's a good possibility that next week we're skipping a week.